Moderator is Jenn Schoepke. Jenn is the Director of Strategic Diversity Planning, Research, and Communication in the Letters and Science Center for Academic Excellence. She was previously an academic planner at UW System Administration. She earned a doctoral degree in Industrial and Systems Engineering here at UW-Madison, where her research focused on issues of whiteness and race and their impact on equity in STEM higher education. Jenn facilitates sessions on the impact of implicit bias on actions with undergraduate students, elementary school teachers and administrators, and community members, for example, at the 2015 YWCA Racial Justice Summit. I'm happy to also say that she is a WISELI affiliate, which is how we were able to talk her into doing this event. So please join me in welcoming Jenn, who will introduce our panelists.
Hi everyone, I'm really excited to see such a great turnout. This is going to be a little different than a typical panel that you may have come to in the past. We wanted to draw on our panelists' expertise today, but we also realized that there's a lot of expertise out in the audience. So there's folks out there who have researched implicit bias, who deal with it on a day-to-day basis, or experience it in their lives. And we want to give space to bring your voices in this conversation as well, and talk not only about the research and what implicit bias is, but also bring it into a practical terms of what do we do with it after we leave this room. How do we manage, minimize it, and move forward to help minimize the impact of implicit bias. Okay, so that said, I'd like to welcome our four panelists today. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then they're going to go ahead and share some of their expertise with us. And then we'll be moving into a small Q&A between me and them, and then we're going to go to our small groups. All right? So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Sheridan. So Jennifer is the Executive and Research Director for the Women in Science and Engineering Leadership Institute, WISELI, on campus. She received her PhD in the Department of Sociology at UW-Madison in 2001, specializing in social stratification and quantitative research methods. Her graduate work focused on the social origins and implications of occupational sex segregation. Jennifer's publications cover topics such as measurement of occupational standing, long-term effects of childhood abuse, and her current line of inquiry, which is the status of women in science and engineering. At WISELI, Jenn develops and oversees the workshops and grant programs administered by WISELI, as well as the research and evaluation produced by WISELI, including 4 waves of the study of faculty work-life climate studies. She's a member of the WISELI team that is nationally recognized for educating faculty about unconscious and implicit bias in academic settings, including the hiring process. Okay, welcome, Jennifer. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Steve Quintana. Professor Quintana is a professor in the Department of Counseling Psychology and Department of Educational Psychology. He is the recipient of several awards, including the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Scholar, Gamble Child and Family Scholar, Excellence in Diversity for School of Education, and Fellow of Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. His research examines the development of ethnic, racial, and cultural perspective-taking ability during the childhood and adolescence. For the past 10 years, he's directed the Diversity Dialogue Initiative, where he has trained nearly 250 facilitators of dialogues and engaged more than 6,000 participants in small group dialogues related to a variety of forms of social differences. If we can welcome Steve to that. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Belinda Gutierrez. She is a psychologist at Madison VA Hospital. She's received her PhD at UW-Madison Counseling Psychology Department, and she served under her advisor, Dr. Quintana, and worked with other members of our panelists. Her research has focused on interventions to reduce unconscious bias. Dr. Gutierrez has developed Molly Carnes NIH-funded video game Fair Play, which she'll be talking about with us. She's currently developing a workshop on implicit bias for VA employees with the goal of raising awareness of the impact of implicit assumptions have on both relationships with colleagues and patient care. If we could all welcome Belinda. And last but not least, Dr. Angelou Byars-Winston is a counseling psychologist and associate professor at the UW Department of Medicine, section of General Internal Medicine and the UW Center for Women's Health Research. Her research examines cultural influences on academic and career development, especially for racial and ethnic minorities and women in the sciences, engineering, and medicine, with the aim of broadening their participation in the STEM fields. Dr. Byars-Winston is translating her research into evidence-based, culturally relevant interventions to increase the persistence of underrepresented groups in STEM. She's also part of the national team funded by the NIH to establish a national research mentoring network, NRMN. Is that how you pronounce that one? All right. She's a member of the STEM Equity Pipeline National Advisory Board and Board of the Higher Education and Workforce and National Academy of Sciences. She's a graduate of San Diego University with her bachelor and master's degrees and Arizona State for her doctoral degree. We could all welcome Dr. Angelou Byars-Winston. So we're going to start off by just talking about what is implicit bias, and Dr. Sheridan is going to take us through a quick overview of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this, I should move it up a little. Is that better? Can you hear me? Thank you. And thank you all for having this panel and for organizing it. So I'm Jennifer Sheridan, and I don't know if you noticed in the bios, I'm a sociologist, and we have 3 psychologists here, and yet I'm selected to give a 5-minute overview on what is implicit bias. So I'll beg forgiveness in advance from my esteemed colleagues who work in this field as I give a very, very, very short summary. Typically, my unit will take anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours to talk about what is implicit bias, but I got 5 minutes. All right. So, many of you came here and you know very well what implicit bias is. You may have studied it, and are aware of it in your own personal life. And maybe some of you are here because you saw the title and you kind of don't know what it is, but you've heard this term bandied about and you want to know more. So I'm going to give you a kind of the swiftest definition I can. There, it worked. Great. In a nutshell, if I had one sentence to describe it, implicit bias happens when we judge individuals based on social characteristics or stereotypes of the groups to which they belong. Now, we are all members of many different social groups individually. We're women and we're men, and we belong to different racial and ethnic groups, and we're all from Wisconsin, and some of us are in the English department, and some of us are in physics. We all have a number of social groups, and with those groups come stereotypes. They emerge. They just do whenever there's some similarity that bring a social group together. And implicit bias happens when people make assumptions about you based on those stereotypes, you as an individual, that may have nothing to do with you personally. It's just part of the group stereotype. And the group stereotype could be real in the fact that, say, it's factually accurate that men on average are taller than women, but when you assume any individual man is taller than he is or a woman is shorter, that's what I mean by applying it to the individual. But it could be imagined. We have stereotypes about people that have no basis in fact whatsoever, and yet we readily apply those to individuals from those social groups. So just to use an example, when we go give our talks, I'm from Wisconsin, and I go to other states and I say, you probably have stereotypes about me as being from Wisconsin. You might assume I like beer, cheese, and the Green Bay Packers. And everybody laughs. But I bet in this room, we could do a little survey and we will find 0, 1, 2, or 3 of those are accurate for any individual person in this room. So none of us are the content of our stereotypes. I was just at Kansas State, and I can't tell you how many people came up to me wanting to talk about Jordy Nelson, a Green Bay Packers player. Apparently he was from there, and they're very proud of him, and I have no idea. We smiled and nodded. I heard the name, but they made that assumption about me. And yes, it's funny and it's a little innocuous in that context. But here's the thing: these kinds of assumptions of stereotypes really hurt certain groups in our educational settings. Group stereotypes lead to these unconscious biases, this application of stereotypes to individuals. Just knowing a group stereotype, and I'm talking about unconscious knowledge that we're not really aware that our mind is processing this way. Just knowing those stereotypes can distort the way we are taking in information. We tend to see information more clearly if it's confirming a stereotype. Okay? Oh, come on. Individuals from groups that are not currently well represented in academia are disadvantaged by this implicit bias process. And this is because group stereotypes often do not well overlap with some of our stereotypes of what is needed to succeed in school. So our stereotype of what is a good student doesn't well overlap with some of our stereotypes about different social groups. Our stereotypes about who is a professor doesn't well overlap with some stereotypes about social groups. And so it makes it more difficult for us to imagine people in those groups filling these roles. Trivial amounts of information can trigger this phenomenon. All it takes sometimes is walking down a hall with pictures of all the past department chairs who look like a certain way for someone to conclude that maybe I don't fit in this discipline. Or for other people to say, this is what just not to pick on physics, but this is what a physicist looks like. Trivial amounts of information. Sometimes just checking your demographics at the top of a form or a test can trigger these kinds of stereotype threats. So it takes very little information for the entire stereotype to come to play, evaluating individuals. And again, stereotyped assumptions can resist disconfirming data. Okay, we tend to only input the data that confirms our stereotypes and ignore data that disconfirms it. And that's part of where we can start to see the solution, right? To pay attention more and make conscious efforts to see all the data when we're evaluating people. So, my 5 minutes is up. If I let you leave here thinking, okay, we all have this implicit bias thing, this is how our minds work, we apply these stereotypes to individuals, but it's how everybody does things, that would be very bad. Because just knowing we all do this doesn't absolve you of the responsibility for taking action to stop it. Okay, so we all need to leave here with the idea that we're all trying to reduce the application of implicit bias. We're trying to keep the unconscious thoughts from seeping into our actions when we work with and evaluate individuals. So, how's that? Okay. It could be much more, but 5 minutes is all I can say. Your slide? Are there any questions? I mean, we might as well for a comment. Trade mics.
I do have a comment regarding the imagination of the bias, saying real or imaginative.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if it's just a matter of semantics, but I would argue that it's actually created by institutions like media or even this own institution or our society versus that I was at home looking outside and imagining,
Right.
stereotypes about Black people.
Right. I guess what I meant by that was, sometimes stereotypes emerge and people can point to a basis of fact to say, well, yeah, statistically men are taller than women, so that's why I applied that stereotype about tall men. But to use an example that we used in our work with the Department of Family Medicine, we were talking about bias in doctor-patient relationships. And there is a pervasive bias against African Americans among physicians thinking they're more likely to have illegal drug use. But in fact, about 10% of both blacks and whites engage in illegal drug use. So for a physician, to assume that a black patient walking in might be an illegal drug user and asking that question more often as opposed to the white patient, that's an imagined characteristic. So that's what I mean. I mean, I agree. They're created by everything around us, and it's difficult to know what's true and what's not, but it doesn't really matter because nobody is the content of their stereotype. Thanks.
Sorry. Well, thanks again for coming to the panel. It's really wonderful to see so many people here. My name is Steve Quintana. As was mentioned, a faculty member in the counseling psychology department. I have a developmental psychology background as well, and so the research I've done has really looked at how children construe race and ethnicity as they're developing. So I've had wonderful conversations with second graders and sixth graders about what it means. But I want to talk to you today about the developmental origin and provide somewhat of an alternate perspective on diversity training. So I've also taught the multicultural class for the department for a number of years, really trying to figure out how is it effective. And if we take a hard look at the data, at least the traditional forms of diversity training isn't all that effective. It works with those volunteers, those people who are willing to come to forums like this, but actually the people that are not volunteers, so people we want to reach, it's ineffective and counterproductive in many cases. They pull back and are resistant to it. So I was interested in sort of how could I reach beyond the typical crowd, beyond sort of preaching to the choir. And so I think the office was launched because of Diversity Day, which was the second episode, and really launched into the public consciousness of it. I think the reason why the diversity training doesn't work as well as we would like it is because it's operating on some common myths that many of us have about child development, the origin of race, bias, and attitudes. And so we think that children are naive, they're blank slates, they don't really learn about race until maybe preschool when they're around people of different groups. And if we can somehow prevent them from learning some of these stereotypes, that they'll be protected against this racial bias. So there's a tendency to sort of teach colorblind attitudes, and then also to be reluctant to sort of expose them to racial stimuli. And then also the sense that if we challenge these stereotypes, we're going to challenge the attitudes, but I'm going to make a case that it's much more difficult than that. So where does implicit racial bias start? It starts at between 3 to 6 months of age. That's where they present infants with different race faces, and they notice that they react differently than they do to same race faces. And so that there's this other race effect that occurs by 6 months of age, and it's a way of which the infant processes the face much differently. So when the other race face is presented, they're scanning the face, they can track where the eyes go, and they're scanning the face to sort of emphasize racial differences. So how is this racial type different from others when presented with an other race effect? Also, the sort of affective reactions that the infant has is that the amygdala is stimulated. This stimulates a startle response and some fear. And also neurologically, they're using a different part of their brain to process other race than same race. And generally, the region of the brain that they're processing on other race faces is, again, more related to fear. And how is this person going to, do I need to fear this person? Whereas when it's for the same race, it's much more focused on more humanizing things. What is this person thinking? What is this person feeling? I wonder what this person is here for me. And it's sort of fostering this more humanizing. And the other race effect is more dehumanizing. And so really the racial bias, at least its developmental origins, is not caused by conflict in interracial settings. It's caused by the lack of contact. It's caused by racial segregation, and so it's really those people that we're unfamiliar with is what will develop this other race effect too. And so with our society that is so racially segregated, it just promotes it, and they find that children in segregated schools are much more biased than the children that are more integrated settings. It'd be nice to believe that we grow out of these other race effects, but actually it gets worse as we get into adulthood. So we're much less able to process racial faces from other groups and have this perception that they look all the same, in part because we're still scanning the faces in ways in which emphasize the racial differences as opposed to individuals to be able to recognize them. And interestingly, it's the shape of the face, the texture or geography of the face, the racial phenotype, more so than skin color. So we teach kids to think about skin color to try to neutralize bias related to that. But that has very little to do with what triggers this other race effect from it too. And in fact, for adults, we know that we shouldn't react in a certain way for skin color, so we're protective against that. But then experimentally, if we just show another race face without the skin color, our reactions are even stronger. So we're not able to protect against it. So all this is happening sort of implicitly, unconsciously. And again, with adults, there's this sort of dehumanizing neural pathways that are reinforced through this effect. So what works? So my sense is that what works is really developing a different experience. So this bias is really a whole body experience ingrained within the person. It's how they're reacting and feeling, and so to really change it is to provide a different experience for that. And what we know back in 1954 is that if these conditions are met for experiential relationships, positive relationships with other groups, that if these conditions are met, then more positive attitudes are fostered as a result of that. And what really, I think, happens is that these personal, affective, relational bonds get developed. And the evidence is very strong through meta-analyses for the last 50, 60 years in laboratory settings, but also real-world settings in terms of the military, integrated housing, and university. Okay. So the anecdote to that would be the diversity dialogues that I try to promote. And so it's really where you try to listen and to relate to people and develop a different experience related to others. And so the idea here is perhaps a challenge to stereotypes, but also to provide a real positive experience where there's a whole body experience within this as opposed to just engaging the mind. And it meets all of the conditions for the intergroup contact. And then I've done these at UW for 10 years, but it's basically the structure, 90 minutes, one session thing, and it's really nice and gratifying to have students who had participated in dialogue a couple years before come up and say, I really remembered, I really want to do it within this agency, this group. And so this is sort of the structure of it. And these are the outcomes for it. So really been able to engage 6,000 participants over the last 10 years and 250 facilitators, and the evaluations are very favorable for it. Many different variations of it. So have worked with fifth graders, have worked with empty nesters in church settings, have worked with youth, high schoolers throughout the university, and then also focused on special groups as well. And then also have worked with the School of Nursing, Engineering, Medicine, Pharmacy, and Education. So, thanks.
I am Belinda Gutierrez, and I would like to thank Jason and Jenn for having me. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel with my former advisor and mentors who I've worked with for years. So I finished my degree here in counseling psychology. I got my PhD in the Department of Counseling Psychology here at UW, and I was lucky enough to be a part of a grant. My research mentor was Dr. Molly Carnes, and she had a grant to develop a video game to reduce unconscious bias. So I've been focused, my work has been focused on developing interventions to reduce bias. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this game. It was called Fair Play. Have any of you played it? Some of you. So my work with that game was really intended to focus on using empathy as a way of reducing implicit bias. So in this game, Fair Play, for those of you who haven't played it, what you do is, and for any of you who are gamers out there, I will say this isn't really a true game. I would call it more of I would say, a interactive drama. So you play the role of this character named Jamal Davis, who's a young black man. He's getting his degree at an all-white or majority-white institution, so he's working towards his PhD. And throughout the game, the overarching goal is that you're getting your PhD. But the subtext is that Jamal experiences all kinds of bias throughout his tenure at the university. And the university, if you played the game, is actually modeled after UW. So you'll see the union. It looks very familiar to you if you play it. So in the game, what you do is you play as Jamal. And what we wanted people to do is have the experience of what it would be like to be an underrepresented minority. So one of the overarching themes of the game is that Jamal has an experience where he shares his work with a colleague, and the colleague ends up using some of his work, and Jamal is actually accused of plagiarism. So that's kind of the drama of the game. But also there's a lot of subtle biases. We call them ambient biases or just environmental biases. For example, as Jamal, you walk through the department, and one of the things you notice is that on the wall there's all of these pictures of former faculty, and they're all old white men. So just we wanted people to really have the experience of what it's like to be a minority, because because we know that individuals who are more prone to believe that implicit bias is a problem and that we need to address this are those who've experienced implicit bias themselves. So we really wanted people to experience what that was like. And for my dissertation, we had graduate students play the game. I was able to take the game to all kinds of conferences and have varying groups of people play, but for my dissertation, we had graduate students here at UW, so I don't know if any of you participated in this. This was a couple years ago. But what we found were that people who empathized with Jamal and felt empathy for his experience had lower implicit bias after they played the game. So that was what I did for my dissertation and postdoc work, and now I'm actually working as a clinical psychologist at the VA hospital here in Madison. And part of my job is to develop an intervention for staff and leaders at the VA on implicit bias. And now I'm becoming a little bit more interested in this idea of stages of change. So Steve talked about people who are less open to these ideas. So measuring really where people are in the stages and targeting my intervention to them specifically. So if you're at this stage where I've experienced bias, I'm sure it's a real thing, I know what it's like, then my intervention is going to look a little bit different for those who may not really even believe that implicit bias is a problem. Just thinking of a particular individual who played the game and told me, well, I've read all the research on bias and I get that it's a thing, but I really don't believe that it's happening. So I'm really interested in finding out where individuals are in this stage of change and then using motivational interviewing strategies to try to move them along. So this workshop's going to be targeted toward individuals at the VA who are in a leadership training course, so people who are already supervisors, and then also people who are just interested in becoming supervisors. So at the VA they have this program called the LEAD program, which is for just all staff who would like to have more leadership role. So we're going to be targeting both of those groups of people. That's what I'm working on now.
And Angela?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Angela Byars-Winston from the Department of Medicine. And I am very honored to be a part of this panel. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you all. Part of the work that I'm focusing on, specifically that I'll talk about today, is building the capacity of historically identified white individual mentors in the research STEM fields who are working with predominantly identified underrepresented racial ethnic minorities. So I have this interesting living laboratory of the traditional, what I would say, Wisconsin model of white faculty working with brown undergraduate students. And the question that we have been trying to address is how do we build the capacity of those mentors who are well-intentioned to be more responsive, to be more effective in interacting across, cultural diversity, specifically race and ethnicity. And I've been very privileged the last couple of years to work with a wonderful group of folk, including some of the folk here on the panel, to address these issues both from a systematic intervention perspective as well as assessing the effectiveness of these interventions. In 1995, Dr. Oliva Espín wrote an interesting paper. She's a professor emeritus from San Diego State University. And she wrote a paper called On Knowing You Are the Unknown. On Knowing You Are the Unknown. And what she highlights is her experience as a Latina psychologist, specifically working around multicultural issues and with many of her white colleagues who literally know nothing about her experience. And the complicating issues that come from not being known to others. A 2013 survey by the Public Religion Institute found that 91% of white individuals in the US have an all-white social network. 91%, compared to 65% of African Americans who have an all-black African American or all-black, all-African American network. What this says to me, building on Dr. Oliva Espín's point, is most of what we know about each other comes from hearsay. Most of us know something secondhand about the other. And so if you complicate and add all of the pieces that Dr. Quintana talked about in terms of how from very early ages, we know nothing about each other, our brains are then socialized and wired to look for homogeny or similarity across groups and to shun, reject, be fearful of that which is different. Complicate that, add 18 years experience, bring that person, those persons to the college experience. And we have a National Institute of Health and certainly a government mandate that says, diversify the STEM fields. And my question is, to what degree are we building the responsivity of these environments to be more effective with the new diversity coming in? Interesting mismatch. And so one of the issues that we're dealing with in implicit bias, specifically in my neck of the woods with faculty who are specifically in the basic sciences, a lot of the life sciences, physical sciences, biomedical sciences, is we have three big challenges in trying to address implicit bias. One is research shows over and over again, I'm thinking of a study by Corinne Moss-Raskusen, that many of our STEM colleagues believe they are immune to implicit bias. I went into science, so I have to deal with that stuff. That's what you all included deal with, right? The mushy stuff. What does race and ethnicity have to do with pipetting in the lab? Good question. That's what I get oftentimes when I deal with my mentors. So that's a big issue, is I'm above implicit bias. Another big issue we're dealing with in trying to promote awareness and cultural consciousness with our STEM colleagues, this is in general the bell curve, not everyone, is the fear of being perceived as prejudice. If I talk about my implicit bias, if I own it, then I will be seen as an IST, right? A racist, a sexist, a homophobe, etc. The third issue we're dealing with in terms of addressing implicit bias is what our colleague Mitchell Nathan calls the expert blind spot. The expert blind spot. It is the erroneous generalization of one's expertness in one domain to being expert in another domain. I'm an outstanding researcher, I have NSF-funded grants, I know what I'm doing as a researcher. Of course I know how to work with people. Of course I know how to mentor students across diversity. And so there are these interesting challenges that I want to talk about, I think we'll get into them, when we start to imagine what are the leverage points to affect interventions that will allow people to move the needle in terms of cultural awareness and being more acknowledging, if you will, of implicit bias. And I'll highlight a few things and then I'll stop, and that is specifically some of the work by Daniel Siegel, if you all have read a New York Times bestseller called Mind Sight. He, along with Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, have showed us over and over again from 20 and 30 years of neuroscience research that insight, personal self-awareness, is the key to other social skills. Personal self-awareness, self-insight, mind sight, having an insight into who I am, is the critical skill set that facilitates the rest of the social skills that are important in being effective in our interactions. So where we are now, just kind of leave with that, is we have now developed, myself and several folk in the room, folk on the panel here, are developing an intervention that is going national through the National Research Mentoring Network. And I was being silly when you were describing, introducing me, but I do have handouts specifically. The National Research Mentoring Network, which is funded by the NIH, is designed to provide a systematic intervention for mentors of those specifically in the biomedical sciences. We now have a six-hour workshop because it is hard to get through these issues in a short amount of time, where we're going with faculty around the country, 15, 16 at a time, to go through a evidence-based, experiential, process-based approach to promoting cultural awareness and specifically to reduce implicit bias. So we could talk a little bit more about that when we get to those examples. Thank you.
And now I'd like to call on Jennifer.
Is this on? Good. So I'll be very brief. I know we're already going over. We all have so much we've done and want to say. So I work with WISELI, the Women in Science and Engineering Leadership Institute, and we have been primarily focusing on faculty at the UW-Madison with our implicit bias interventions. we started by working with faculty hiring committees and taking the kind of research that we've all been kind of talking about and really targeting the hiring process. And how do these things play out in a hiring process when you're reading someone's CV or interviewing them? That's how we kind of started, and it turns out the faculty really enjoyed that part. And interestingly, over time, they moved from just wanting to learn about the implicit bias to wanting to know what to do about it. And we have been increasing then our content in the workshops around the strategies for change. And because that was so important, we got another grant to really develop a larger workshop just about implicit bias, what it is, how it plays out in a variety of our academic settings, and then what you can do about it from an individual level. And that one we did as a pair-matched experimental design. We selected 92 STEM with a 2 M's, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, departments or units of departments. We pair-matched them and randomly selected one from the pair to receive the workshop. The others were control groups. And we delivered a 2.5-hour bias workshop that included strategies for change to the experimental departments. And we found that the experimental departments, the faculty had more motivation to act without bias. They had the self-efficacy, the tools we gave them were helpful, and they felt like they could make changes. And for the departments where 25% or more of the faculty actually attended the workshop, we saw action. Self-reported action, like speaking up in department meetings when you see bias, that kind of thing. So we had some really promising results, and now it's 3 years beyond the end of the experiment, and we were looking at hiring recently, and the departments who came, the experimental departments actually significantly hired more women, and they also had an increase in the hiring of underrepresented minorities and non-whites in general. That was not statistically significant, but it's an increase, whereas the other control departments were either the same or a slight decrease. So we're really excited about this idea that if you provide people the strategies, you know that can really influence change. So I just brought some of our materials here in case you want to know more about it.
So I have just a couple of questions for our panelists, and then I'd like to move us into the small group discussion. So I'm just going to throw out a few questions, and maybe we'll take the next 10 minutes to cover these questions. So anyone who wants to answer, why is it important to know about implicit bias in education?
The research shows that it's not the explicit bias of parents and teachers that influences their children, but it's the implicit bias that affects them. So it's really the attitudes that are sort of conveyed much more implicitly. And it's not so much what the parents say or the teachers say, but it's that they found connections between the implicit bias of parents and their children's attitudes.
Anyone else?
Just makes me think of what you're saying, also in regards, not in regards to race, but gender. I can think of numerous studies that have looked at the subtle differences in how we treat our children from 5 to 6 months of age, and how those can predict the different career fields that individuals will go into. So from 5 to 6 months of age, even though we don't intend to, we may treat our male children differently than female children, and then that is actually predictive of the types of careers. So females are more likely to go into humanities and those types of fields, and then they find that that's actually our own unconscious behaviors that we do to our children. So it's very relevant.
A critical piece that we're finding in our research is that the experience of the other, so underrepresented racial minorities specifically that we've been working with, their experience of and perception of implicit bias by those who are mentoring and teaching them has a direct impact on their sense of belonging and comfort fit in the lab, in the classroom, in the learning environment. There's a direct statistical relationship between the experience and perception of implicit bias in those who are supervising me, teaching me, mentoring me. and its relationship to my sense of belonging in that environment. And we know from 50 years of research in higher education that persistence in an academic field towards degree completion is correlated with belonging, comfort, fit. So think about your own experience when you felt like you didn't belong. Think about that. All of us have had some experience in our life where it felt like, these are my people, I don't fit here, no one gets me. How motivated are you to show up with your A game every day? How much are you willing to risk and put yourself out there? It could be at a job, it could be in a classroom, it could be in a relationship, right? So we know that it's a critical piece about the impact on the student in terms of their performance in education.
That brings up a really nice point of how many students are we losing because of implicit bias. So and that leads me to the next question that I like to ask is, so how do we measure it? We've talked about the impact of it. How do we actually measure implicit bias? Does anyone want to take me up on that one?
My name's on the list, so. Again, you know, I'm taking the sun away from the psychologist here, but implicit bias, you know, in the past, really we could only measure the explicit things. And these are the things that we're aware of, we can control our attitudes. And so that's really where you've seen a lot of social change over time, right? You answer a survey question. Do you think, you know, and the General Social Survey is a great example. They've been asking since like the 50s. Do you think it's okay for blacks and whites to marry? Do you think it's okay for women to work outside the home? And people are no longer answering in a biased way to those questions. So explicitly, we've made a lot of progress, but the implicit measures are the ones that bypass our conscious processes. And psychologists have used like eye contact or how close you'll sit to, or like who you're going to sit next to on the bus kinds of measures. But then in about the 90s, they developed this really cool online tool called Implicit Association Test. And how many of you have taken one of these? You can just Google IAT and you can go to Harvard's website and there's like 15 of them on there in a variety of topics. And I highly recommend you explore that page. What it does is it gives you words or pictures or phrases and asks you to sort them very, very quickly. And it measures how, using the time it takes you to sort them, how tightly concepts are connected in your mind. And that IAT now has been the source of a lot more research in this area because we can now make connections between, if you have implicit biases, what is your behavior like? And is that more predictive, your implicit score, than your explicit score on a test? And that's how we know how important these processes are in the outcomes we're seeing. Anybody has any?
And just related to the research I cited and have looked at is that they have physiological measures and eye tracking as well as skin responses and things like that. And through that, they realized that within milliseconds of meeting someone, with processing the person's race, gender, social class, and all the associations that go along with that. So it happens on an automatic basis, and it happens completely outside of our awareness. So afterwards, they ask the people, did you notice the person's race? And they'll say, no, I didn't. But then all the other indicators suggest that they were very processing it on an automatic level.
So the next question is going to tee it up for our small group discussion. So what are potential interventions for confronting implicit bias in the educational settings?
So obviously my take on it is to really pair some academic cognitive exercises with some real life personal experiences with it too. And so a lot of the things that I mentioned about Alport that was on the slide was the need for equal status. And so many of our contexts that we experience people of different racial groups is not when there's equal status. So between a mentor and a student, for example. Those conditions are not as favorable in terms of promoting it. And in fact, more likely to reinforce some previous attitudes from that. So I think, and also with having these sort of automatic reactions is we're human and we want to believe that we're rational people. So in order to sort of account for why I'm reacting this way, in some way I generate some stereotypes. So to just challenge the stereotypes without replacing them also with other experiences with it would leave the need to develop those stereotypes left unmet.
So some of the things that we're beginning to work on is the pushing of the envelope for the faculty that we're intervening with to move beyond just learning about the other. So many times in multicultural interventions and cultural diversity awareness workshops, we're focusing on what do I need to know about them, right? Like, tell me what I need to know to work with African American students. Tell me what I need to know. It's like this cultural smorgasbord. And we're really focusing on the self-awareness component. And I think the literature that we're really drawing on is a lot of the work that's been organized by Beverly Daniel Tatum in the book, Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, if you've read that before. And what she describes is, again, this fear-based early socialization that we have with focusing on talking about differences, but this other part that in this country, we don't equip our children, and certainly then the cumulative effects show up as an adult, we do not equip ourselves to talk about cultural differences. She gives an example that's very poignant in the book where a young white girl and her mother are in a grocery store and there's an African American girl and her mother, and the little girl says, "Look, Mommy, her skin is dirty." And the white girl says that, and the mother of the white girl says, "Shh, don't say that," and hushes her away. And the association that this child hears in the message is, we don't talk about those things. These are not polite issues, it's offensive, as opposed to, let's talk about what that difference is. It is very reasonable for some young child to think that my skin is made of chocolate milk, right? It's just an early association. But if the messages are that we don't talk about those things, then again, add 20 years of life experience, and now we're saying, let's talk about what that means. It's a lot of anxiety and fear-based experiences. So we do a lot of uncovering in our interventions of early associations, early experiences, early attachments to difference.
Basically just going to say what Dr. Byars-Winston said and just reiterate that it's imperative that we have open dialogue, and I think that's what I'm really focusing on now, is creating a space where people feel that they can talk about these things, because these are not easy topics to discuss, and everyone's coming from a different perspective, and we've all had our experiences with this, but we need to be able to discuss these things. So that's what my current intervention is focused on. I previously worked on the game, which I think is a great way to introduce the idea and to build some awareness, but I think, as Angela was saying, insight and the ability to actually have discussions that are meaningful.
Oh, I guess I have one. And yes, and from our point of view, we've been really finding this idea of actions that, you know, you can talk and you can learn that you have these biases, but a lot of people leave the room going, well, what am I supposed to do? Give me some things to practice to do. And so we've been working really hard to, okay, here, you know, examine your department's website and walls and, you know, think of that from the experience of your students of color. Just, you know, do that as a department exercise. Look at the diversity statement that your department is putting out there. What does it say? You know, is it a colorblind or a multicultural message? You know, take a look at that. So we're trying to give them some specific things so that they feel like they can start working on it, and not just kind of wallow in this, I have bias, what do I do? Space.
And that's where we're gonna go into small groups. So we're gonna get together, and Jason's gonna help me divide you all up into 6 groups, and we're gonna engage in conversation. So talk about our own implicit bias, talk about how we're situated in a community with such severe equity gaps, and what can we do about that. You have 6 minutes of no structure, so have fun with that. Is there anyone who would like to start?
So can I go off script and ask, I would love to bequeath our time to the audience, and just wondered if there were any 6 minutes of closing thoughts from the audience.
I love that idea. I love unscripted. So I will play, I'll go around with the mic, and then just raise your hand. Is there question.
I don't know if this is a bad question because it might be too big of a question, but the biggest thing that I always run into when I'm thinking about topics like this is the fight to get to the non-believers, the people who aren't already on board with affecting change in these problematic areas. I was curious, I don't know, yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question and something I've been thinking about this whole talk is it's so wonderful that we have such a big group of people. I wasn't expecting so many people to be here. This is really nice. But I often find that I'm preaching to the choir every time. It's people who already are bought into these ideas. And so thinking about how we can move people towards recognizing that this is important. And so I've been using more of the stages of change model. I don't know if you are familiar with it. It's been used a lot with smoking cessation and a lot of health behavior change. So really trying to meet people where they are. If they're in a pre-contemplation is the first stage, so maybe not even quite aware of this, then we present more of the research, why this matters, what makes this important, and then trying to use motivational interviewing techniques, which is something that's used a lot in psychology when we're trying to get people to change, get them to that point of change, to bring people a little bit along the curve. Because I think you're absolutely right, oftentimes we end up talking to the converted already, so I think it is a problem.
Well, through the dialogues, I get a real nice feel of the pulse of the undergraduates, and they're finding, they remember messages they got at SOAR, where, for example, going around and using preferred pronouns. And at first they didn't get it, but then it really opened their eyes and they started exploring that a bit more. And then over time, they really sort of realized that they could find out more about that, and it really leads to a lot of change. So I think change happens in small steps. It takes change in terms of introducing new ideas to people, planting the seed, and then also reinforcing that with follow-up programming.
So, says the sociologist in the group, one of the things I think we really find success with is when we go into departments and try and get more people in a unit speaking the same language and having the same ideas and building more social pressure to act without bias and to be able to have a conversation that says, I wonder if you would have evaluated that resume the same if it was a man's. Can we just step back and take a second look at this? And just if we can change those cultural norms in our departments and units, that's another way to get people who wouldn't come by themselves aware of the ideas and on board, because there's kind of this social norm changing in their immediate units. And some of our results by going into departments with all the faculty, it's hard because there are definitely resistors, but all of a sudden everybody has the same language to start to talk about it. So we found some success trying that.
We had a question in the front row up there.
Hi, is age and disability does that come up? And if it does, that's great. If it doesn't, how would you suggest trying to incorporate that into the conversation?
And sexual orientation as well, and gender identity. There's just so much less research along those ways, but we do try to incorporate those topics when we can. There's a study that we like to use sometimes about, it was an interview, and this is in the disability context, and it was filmed, but from two different angles. So one angle you could see a wheelchair, and the other angle you couldn't, but otherwise it was the exact same interaction. And raters, if they saw the wheelchair version, would rate the quality of the interviewee lower than if they saw the other angle without the chair. And so we find studies like that as much as we can to point out how these stereotypes affect all sorts of social groups. And we have sexual orientation ones that we found.
And we have special dialogues set up for those, and I think what's valuable is for all the students to sort of review all the privileges, the intersecting identities that they have, and to be able to own the privileges that they have, as well as the ways in which they're sort of target of some of the implicit bias. And so then they can then transfer a little bit of this awareness and perspective taking that allows them to sort of cross over some of these identities.
So I think we have time for one more question. Right there.
Hi, I had a quick question. I know a lot of us are educators on campus, and I currently teach a one-credit course for transfer students. And in introducing this topic, I was wondering, they're left wondering, okay, how can I make a change after I'm suddenly aware of this implicit bias that I may have? What would you say is the most effective strategy, single most effective strategy to empower them to be agents of change?
One thing we've found is that being exposed to first-person accounts of these experiences are wonderful ways to sort of develop the empathy and perspective taking that it requires. So that there's really some powerful media as well as books that really portray the sort of insider perspective of all those things, and it's really hard to then to be comfortable with these implicit biases when you're very aware of the personal dimensions and consequences of that.
And I would concur with that, that the humanizing of implicit bias is critical. That there are faces and stories and real life impact outcomes on people's lives, intergenerationally as well, for these types of dynamics. And one of the concrete pieces that I think we've been focusing on is the 30-day cultural awareness challenge. Beginning to think about for 30 days, take time to do a cultural scan every day. And think about the ways that you're interacting, think about the ways you set up your classroom, think about the ways you're talking. Think about, just notice what you attend to. Notice where you're uncomfortable. Notice where you feel most comfortable. So there's a series of kind of interactions I think that we are leaving folk out of the door with, as Jenn Sheridan mentioned, to say, as you now have this aha moment, tell like, here are bias, there are bias, everywhere bias. You're overwhelmed, but if we invite ourselves to just being a noticing things, and then being able to give people resources and where to go next with some concrete strategies is also really helpful.
And we've worked with Patricia Devine in psychology, who has studied unconscious racial bias for most of her career, and she says to people, the first thing is to accept the humbling possibility that you too could be complicit in the application of unconscious bias. And we find that to be also kind of eye-opening, accepting that in yourself, because that's a big hurdle for me.
And I would add onto that, so I know we mentioned it, and I think it came up in several groups, there's the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. So that's online at Harvard's website. Google IAT, and you can take it. If you've already taken it, take it again. I've taken it many, many times, and I'll tell you, I'm not happy with the score I come up with every time. So, but go ahead, that's a good start, and I love Angela's suggestion that 30 days. 30 days is nothing. You know, I commit to more than that all the time, so I can do 30 days. So I want to honor our time. So first, 2 rounds of applause. The first round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. And the second round of applause is for you all. So thank you for participating. I really appreciate it.